tell us who you are and how you got into Eve.
So my name is MILINT ARC Trooper. I actually joined Eve in August of 2020. Kind of was an escape for me because at the time I was working as an essential worker during the COVID era. And I ended up kind of stumbling across Eve Online during that time frame. Actually, re-stumbling across it because I had actually been introduced to your game via a magazine. And the magazine was actually talking about Baltec at the time. So the famous Baltec fits, like the famous, if I remember correctly, was a Kronos or one of the ships adjacent to the battleship, the Galente battleship, and they had actually figured out how to make it run faster than a frigate. So there was always a battleship running with a frigate ball. Um, but that was actually what was my actual introduction to Eve was first a magazine, and then a couple years later, when 2020 came around, was when I actually joined. My points of interest in this particular CSM run and why I'm running is I want to make sure that there's a more broad spectrum of the game balance and concepts. I'm really intrigued by the hauling community. I'm also intrigued by the mining community and the exploration because these are kind of the backbone of the game. And it's also one of the things I think a lot of new bros really want to get into, or they think they should get into, and it's very difficult for them to start. Now, I want to make sure that we have things like additive content. I want to have things that where people are intuitive so they can understand how to get into it, and ways that then these things lead to a natural growth that then you end up becoming more aggressive in your PvP or your faction warfare.
So, is that your entire platform? Is just the industry hauling and exploration, or do you have any other things that you'd like to be able to influence?
Well, I also my you know that my notoriety is more for interest of fitting of ships and actually fitting them in different ways because to me I like the sandbox element of EVE Online where there is no hard set rules on how you fit a ship. At the same time, I also think it's actually one of the problems that a lot of new bros have is they don't really understand how to fit a ship even from the basic thought processes. And there's a lot of people that they'll come into the EVE Discord or they will go into other locations and they will ask for help. And many times they may get somebody who actually is helpful, but then you also get some people getting a preloaded, what we call a kill fit, basically a fit that's exactly designed to be countered by the poster's own ship, and that's always something that I always warn some people, be very careful which fit you get because sometimes that person's trying to set you up for a kill. But there's a lot of things in Eve that we can add. There's a lot of things that Eve could probably use a little fine tuning. There's a lot of potential in Eve, and that's what I'm more interested in is broad spectrum approach. Let's add some small things here and there, and then make it so it's a much grander story of Eve, and kind of putting it more of the fun back into Eve again.
Okay, so you have mentioned new players a few times. What do you think is the biggest challenges that they're facing in Eve today?
The first problem for most new bros is when they come into the game, it is literally, it's almost like a labyrinth. And if you have the players that, if you just drop somebody in, a lot of people will come because they've seen the ad. They think the ad's going to be this all awesome meat. We're going to go straight into fighting. But then as soon as they drop into Eve, they realize it's a slog. And I have a saying that there's actually like four paths or five paths in Eve. And a lot of those paths are what really kind of kill some of the new bros. So like you have the old, the old guard gamers in Eve. They tell you, oh, there's a skill cliff. And that's usually the old fashioned players like, oh, you go straight up. And I do have a lot of respect for those that have climbed the skill cliff in order to get up to where they're at. But then there's like other pathings in order for people to get in. New bros do have a problem where they get very confused because of a lot of counterintuitive UI. There's not very straightforward explanations of how to fit a ship or walkthroughs. The movies and videos, even though they're better now, they added to the NPE the videos that explain how you do some things. There some informational loss, so is a little bit of also issue where players have to access outside of the game information in order to understand how the game works. And it's a little bit frustrating because you'll get some players who then they're also handed out the welcome packet, and it's immediately punch you out into a certain area under a certain group's mindset. And they never really get to see the full breadth and the story and the lore of this game and what you could do. It's very kind of frustrating to deal with. It's basically convoluted UI, non-intuitive systems, and then time crunch for a lot of players. That's one of the problems that really is a very big challenge for basically the new bros. And then on top of that, if you actually were to look at it from certain perspectives, cost does start to also stack up as well. Particularly if you start going Omega, and it really can shut down a lot of players.
Right. So, when is the last time that you actually ran through the new player experience, the MPE?
I did that about a year ago, but I also keep up to date by watching players who are running it again. Like recently, there was a Russian player that was actually running the NPE, and I was actually surprised that they had actually added when they removed all the login bonuses for normal players, they had left a login track just for new players,
Yep.
which I think was very interesting and helpful. I I came in when I came into the game in 2020. They still had the old Concord based NPE, so I basically came in with the circadian sleepers. I had but they also had some missions that you don't have anymore, which I think also in some weird way has also reduced what a new bro can actually make or incentive in order to find out things in the game. The new NPE is actually really impressive from a graphical standpoint, and I do like it, but the problem is it's kind of like you have a big show and then something you're up into the middle, and so you go from a wonderful train and then you're dropped off the train and straight into a ghost town in the middle of nowhere. And you're like, where am I supposed to go?
So, what do you think about the introduction of the Air Career Program?
It is actually it's impressive from a graphical standpoint. It's very good, but then it's like whereas the old Concorde dropped you in and it basically told you, "Oh, you're now awake. Do these and follow your instructions," and then you ended up completing a chain. There was actual Concorde chain that you would run, and then you would then go to do your missions for your school, as we call it. The new one's kind of weird because it's like you go in and there's like a story that you're supposed to follow, and then the story immediately abruptly stops. So like you don't really see who's the person behind this situation. And so it kind of is a little jarring because as you do the NPE, oh, we're supposed to figure out whoever this unknown attacker is. You would think there'd be a storyline that would actually lead to it, or you'd have other missions to go around the game to figure out what it is, and then, oh, we solved the problem of whichever group is attacking us in the start, which would be kind of interesting. Uh, but I hopefully hope that CCP actually works that in, where they actually create basically some storylines that you can, as a new bro, follow around until it's solved. But that's not exactly how a lot of the missions and things in the game are actually set up. There's very few of those in the game.
Right. What I was referring to, the Air Career Program. So, it
Mhm.
starts, roughly when you're in one or two of the first career mission story arcs. You start
Mhm.
gaining skills and
Mhm.
modules in ISK for doing
Mhm.
things. So it's kind of supposed to be an off ramp to get you
Yeah.
interested in industry or interested in going out and trying to kill someone or
Yeah.
stuff like that.
And that's actually it is a nice item. It actually works fairly well. The There are some little hiccups, and when I was actually doing the testing on it, one of the problems is I actually had parallel testing. So I had because they allowed us to retroactively do the air career system after we had already skilled up like our main. And I actually made during that time an actual a testing alt. I don't use alts. So if I do an alt, it's usually for testing to check out what they've added. And one of the things and then I usually burn the alt afterwards. But the thought process was when I was doing it, I parallel tested it, and at the time it was very bugged. And you basically could just be in the starter mission in a starter system and get all of them done because there was like repeating loops and there was all kinds of bugs. Now it's been fixed. There are some spots that are still problematic. I think the section for the Soldier of Fortune is a little tricky because there's a section of it that actually does for logistics, and a lot of players don't really do logistics until much later in the gameplay. It does give you a lot of skill points and enough money to actually help a lot of players. Um, Depending on how fast you do it, is a question for players because most new players probably won't finish it until about a year, maybe plus into it. But if they're really dedicated, they could probably get it done in less than half a year or maybe within a month, depending on if they really focus on the items in question. The Air Career program is actually very useful, but to me, one of the problems I have with it is it's like kind of an unnecessary UI system because you've got air, you have agency, and then you have opportunities. And I'm like, condense it all down and actually put it as a tab inside the agency because it makes it very confusing for the players because they're looking at which button do I push, and it's
Right.
very confusing. But overall, the skill plan and the reward system for new bros, it actually is useful, but some people might get very frustrated with it because they'll have there's one mission where you have to actually mine a very specific ore. Now, if you're very careful and you understand what you're doing in the starting mission, there actually is a mining mission that actually gives you a particular ore, so kernite. But that item is if you were to stay in the mission. So once you complete it, it's the one where there's a spy. So you have to act like you're mining in order to catch the spy. Well, when you do that, most people will kill the spy and then leave. Well, that rock that's in that mission is enough to finalize your mining for that particular resource. But most people won't read this because they're just trying to finish the mission and go down the track, even though the track has a fairly long time frame to finish. And so that's an interesting, odd, problem that's actually in the air program, but it's also an interesting thought process as well for new bros because if
Okay.
they don't know it, they're not going to be able to make it.
So discussing the MPE, the Air Career program, these little problems. What do you think CCP could do to help with new player retention?
Uh, maybe maybe aiming for more achievable goals and probably setting it out because like the skill plans and stuff, you can actually get a lot of the ship access within 2 weeks. I've actually mapped out things where you can do things within 2 weeks, but most people could probably easily get into, cruisers or frigates. But I think the process is instead of everybody trying to jump to the highest ISK making item, which usually generally is cruiser based for a new bro, why not set it up so it's like, oh, here's your goal, try to get to a frigate or a destroyer and then to a cruiser. Like give them the time frame so they understand how they can get to it and it allows the players to do it. And some of these like frigates are fairly easy to get into, but it also depends on which faction you are. And the problem is people the experience of also starting is kind of odd because it really doesn't give you any loyalty, feeling to your faction that you start with. Because most people they just move straight through their faction, so they don't get to appreciate the lore and the storyline involved. Um, it would be interesting if people actually would try to stay around and check out stuff, but I think CCP needs to add, just a few small little tweaks and little bonuses, maybe even teach them the concepts of like LP using the starting mission so people kind of realize, oh, I'm rewarded not just in ISK, but I'm also rewarded in LP, and I can spend it in the LP stores to get unique items. And there's just some fine tweaking of the experience and basically systems instead of having to like sense scarcity, we have hard content barriers. So where you want this resource, you want this mineral, you have to go to low sec. we used to have before scarcity, we had a gradient, and the gradients actually kind of work because people like, oh, I can get better items. I need to go here. Whereas if you do hard content, it's when the new bro goes to go take care of, his air program, and he gets blown up the first time after he's been spending a lot of time to build his first or buy his first venture or whatever other ship, and he's trying to do the content to finish out his air
Mm.
program, and he gets blammed the first time. It usually kind of shuts down the players, but then some people continue. That's maybe open different avenues to get into content, but not to do so harshly, so that then it's a make or break moment. So new players can understand it's not the end of the world, but it's just the start.
Okay. So, speaking of when we talk about new player retention, one of the things that CCP
Mhm.
has really iterated on over the last several years, and I am sure even before I started playing, is
Mhm.
community. And community,
Mhm.
going in, meeting someone, whether it's the person that melted your face off in a wormhole, or finding a corporation or a alliance, community is important and it keeps people engaged. What is your definition of community within Eve?
Well, most of the time for me, community is basically like-minded individuals that interact, on different content and other materials. Now, some can be intrapersonal, some can be extrapersonal. So some of the community, they actually make friendships and they actually are able to go outside of the game of Eve. But then there's also in-game, community, which basically means like once you turn on this computer and you play the game, your community is whoever content or the materials that you're working with. Now, granted, each community is developed around its content or its sometimes its own ideas of how Eve is run. So it's more or less just a loose framework of what people want to do interacting with content.
Okay. And we kind of talked about this a little bit before we started about toxicity. And for those who are going to watch the video or are tuning in right now, I do not consider ganking in itself or PvP or even the interconflicts and drama in game to be
Mhm.
toxic. What I'm talking about is all of those things that really shouldn't be talked about or thought about in 2024. So,
Mhm.
what is your stance on toxicity within Eve, and do you think it's a big issue?
Now, I will say this is that he says, yes, ganking itself is not a toxic item, but the problem is you can use ganking as a weapon of toxicity. So one can use ganking in a toxic manner, and usually to harass or attack somebody in the game consistently, trying to force them to leave the game. Now, there is a variation of it that's called griefing, where people actually go into an area and they actually will deliberately basically gank people who are just starting and harass them until they don't want to start the game. And you'll always get some people there. Now, to me, toxicity is people who they really don't have good gamemanship. They really just want to cause people frustration, irritation. We also call it salt mining, etc. But I think in Eve, it is a problem where people do, if you don't like somebody, you start to then attack them for that thought process, etc. But one of the things that we should do is that toxicity itself, it shows that the other person is not in a good spot. So when we do the toxicity thought process, I prefer to be is just be polite, and if you lose and once you get into a mindset that you understand you can replace your ships, it becomes basically not a big deal. But if you allow the toxic person to, you know, enjoy that thought process of that they've caused you pain or frustration, they're going to continue to do it. But when you start to realize you can just replace your ships, or you can do other content, or you can log off for a little bit, and then that person has to go find his content elsewhere. That's this. But personally, I think that the Eve community has to make a thought process of, hey, let's be good and let's have a culture of at least politeness, even though we can be adversarial. And It is an issue though when you have some people that they are allowed to be toxic because they have a certain image of Eve and how they think it, and then those people are allowed to basically stay. And the problem is that Eve actually has a bad boy image, even outside of the gaming sphere. I've actually talked to people who actually have had discussions about it, and a lot of people actually will not join Eve because
Yeah.
of the toxicity level of certain groups precedes them and has actually made people not want to join this game, even though they like the game, they like the
Yeah.
idea. They refuse to join the game because they've heard about what goes on in the game through its various different external toxic interactions. And that is a problem that has pretty much basically stopped a large portion of new blood that could come in the game and actually breathe a lot of life into it.
So, in my recent experience, I've been having a lot of Eve Rookie members who tend to be players that are everywhere from day one to maybe up to 100 days. And they've been trying to get into some different content. They've been showing me screenshots of some particularly vile stuff, casual
Mhm.
racism, you know, homophobia, transphobia, stuff like that. Where do you think it occurs the most? And if you personally encounter it, what do you do when you see it?
So here's one of the interesting things, though, is that they actually used to have a lot of it actually used to be encapsulated in what was known as mining chat, and then later, rookie help in game. The It got so bad that actually one of the channels in the game actually had to be nuked from orbit, as it were. But I think the problem was the people basically just spread out and just kept doing it. To me, it's more about the person, how you react it. It's not about the action that's important, it's the reaction. And it's sometimes, I know it's hard for some people because everyone has their own personal pain spot that really, really makes them very hurt a lot. But also, if you are able to, how should I say it, tank it in this situation, you actually can outlast it. You show yourself to be the bigger person. However, though, it is not acceptable in the game. And I really wish we did have a little bit more internal policing in the game, whether by CCP or the ISD.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is here is that the levers of power in this game, people just as easily weaponize the reporting system in the opposite direction as well. So let's say you do see a problem, it can backfire on you, and your group or you yourself can be punted straight out of the game for reporting a problem. And that is a major issue in the game that has been a little bit of a frustration because people that have actually come under attack can end up in a lot of problems. Now, some groups, some Twitch streamers actually do, because Twitch has a policy that I remember hearing about where if someone constantly is stream sniping you, you can actually end up reporting the person and there can be a ban placed on that person. Basically, but the problem is how is that enforceable because people have alts and they can just swap and keep doing it. And the problem is, here's the thing, is that if something happens in my area, either you ignore the problem, which is one way of doing it, you move on to another system, but if you're being harassed and trailed around, that's kind of hard to get away from. You either, just put your stance out there and say, nope, I'm not going to do that. Or, you end up making your own community language of sorts that allows you to stay away from it, or you curate the issue. And it's a problem, yes, and I know a lot of the new players, get very, very frustrated very quickly, and some of them feel very this. But also, you as a player and encapsulator in EVE Online, OPSEC is a very important thing. You give your attackers the ammunition to attack you, so you have to learn OPSEC about information. But in reality, information warfare is a big part of EVE, and I think that's also another thing that a lot of new bros do not understand, is that you give your enemies as much information as they will harm you.
Right.
And so you have to think about it differently when you've come into this game. You have to be very careful about who knows what about you, etc. So if you're a new bro, I know you're used to coming into a lot of games where you can just start talking about whatever you want, but this game is opposite. You come into the game and you have to be very careful about the information you give out because people will use it, and Eve is known for it. So, but I would say on a personal level, so
Are you
that
oh,
well, so don't feed the issue, but also your reaction is also what you need to temper. So if you show that you're not going to react, it actually makes the other person who's doing the attacking look really, really bad, and then usually that ends up with them ending up with the black eye, as it were, because it reflects on them.
okay.
Well,
So
yes.
we're going to jump into a completely different mindset now. And this
Hmm.
has become what is one of my favorite parts of this particular interview now. We're going to pretend that you have made it to the CSM.
Hmm.
So you made it to CSM19. You go to your very
Hmm.
first meeting where CCP reveals to you what's going to be coming on the next expansion and maybe even what's
Hmm.
coming within the year of your term. Not
Okay.
one thing that you have campaigned for is going to be on the docket. Not one thing that you have expertise in is going to be on the docket. What are you going to
Hmm.
do?
Well, that's actually one of the other things too, is that do not promise what you cannot keep. But at least, add consultant for small things instead of, large things. I think it's actually better to ask questions, to ask to see, okay, well, these items that are in here, they're not on my stuff. They're not going to be in here. But ask, can we do like one or two small things? Don't make, I need the entire ship line, a whole new ship line slapped into the game. Instead, can we modify this one ship by a certain stat, make a good, agreement, etc. See if it can be done. Small things at time and pace. But be polite, be respectful, you know, maybe even ask, okay, what does this new content do? How does it affect what we already have? And ask the questions, look at the stats, and if there's something there that probably doesn't look quite right, then say, hey, um, can we talk about this? Can we consult about, what's the thought process? How does this work? But even if it's stuff that's not on your docket, at least understand that you're representing the basically the people of Eve. So even though there are things that you would like to do, understand that CCP as a company also has their own timeline. But when you do that, at least remember you're representing the people of Eve. And
Okay.
that's the thing that's important. So represent everybody, even the people that didn't vote for you. That's what you're supposed to do.
All right. Good answer. So now you are in a meeting and CCP tells you that they're going to act something that's important to your gameplay or the gameplay of the community that you represent. For example, one of the things that a lot of the CSM, especially the small gang CSM, have been advocating
Mm-hmm.
for is the getting rid of drone assist. Now, for me, that's very important to the incursion playstyle,
Mm-hmm.
but it may not be very important to others, and it could be logical to get rid of it for bots. So, what are you going to
Mm-hmm.
do if your community's playstyle is on the chopping block?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's also the other thing that one of my viewpoints in a situation is because it becomes a competitive system where like you have the small gangers who are constantly championing for one particular item and they want to destroy it because they know it's going to affect their problem, but it's also going to positively affect their playstyle. But it has unintended consequences, not just for the incursion run, but it also does stuff for mining and other materials for various different other content. So doing this simplistic approach of just attacking one piece of content and trying to fix the other, I would actually ask, okay, is there another solution? Because
Okay.
with the drone assist, I've actually been talking very point blank over on the Eve Discord about an idea where, well, if you're having an issue with drone assist, why not we bring certain tools and modules that allow you to actually affect a combatant's drone control capability? So instead of trying to directly smash the content, I'm like, hey, why don't we give you tools that allow you to manipulate your combatant's drone capacity, speed, range, etc., and allow you to actually directly interact with it, giving you and the player something that has to be played out. And so that's my thought process. If a piece of content that is going to be axed, I will ask first, okay, the reasoning for that. And then I might offer a side content, not a complete attack. Oh, don't do that. I'm like, okay, is there another way, another solution to fix this problem? And that's how it should be done is you give options and say, well, this, and this could be done. Which one is it? And maybe even CCP will still continue beyond that, but at least I put out the thought process of there are multiple things here instead of immediately going on the attack defense, or if there's a problem in the game, instead of trying to simplistically knock it out using the CSM, okay, what's the problem? What are the materials in question? And then how do we get different options before we just completely axe it? Because I know there's going to be unintended consequences that will affect the game negatively if we just knock out one thing because of one case scenario.
So one of my experiences is definitely when something is coming up that could affect your gameplay is talking it out
Mm,
and looking at all the different aspects of gameplay, because what affects PvP may not affect PvE, but you still have to balance it for everyone.
hmm
Now,
yes. And so
the
like the
go ahead.
and so like okay, so a good example is this fits. PvP and PvE fits, there are actually some overlap. So the problem is if you try to balance everything for PvP, you can actually negatively affect the PvE side. Or if you try to buff something for PvE, it might make the PvP side too strong. And so it's like one of those weird things where you have to kind of look at the material and say, okay, what exactly you're trying to do, figure out where the context is, and then, work that out. And so it is a problem in Eve is where some people, like when they did the buffs for the battleships, it was understandable that battleships needed a buff, but what happened was the buffs were so stacking that it really affected a lot of ships from both T1 all the way up to T2 when it could have been easily done where each faction had a slight modification and specialized set of bonuses only for those two particular battleships instead of a blanket, slap and there's 50% for armor just straight up. It would have been better if like each faction, like Amar has the armor, or you have, Kaldari has a better regen speed bonus, or you have, Minmatar
Mhm.
has a little combination of both, and then you have Galente has some benefit to its armor reppers, but it would be for each faction. I understand that sometimes the devs don't want to go the long route. It's just easier to copy pasta.
Okay, so I have one last question in the let's pretend category here.
Yes.
Players expect the CSM to go and fix issues, or
Mhm.
demand. I mean, go in there with chest beating and yelling and making CCP listen. Have you given to any thought whatsoever on how you're going to balance the limitations placed on you as a CSM, as far as being an advisor and being behind the NDA, with making sure that players actually feel heard?
Yes, there is that thought process, and that's actually one of the things that I would like to actually try. I think one of the other problems also is that because we have the combative mindset of players versus CCP, that, and due to past scandals and other problems that have happened in the past, it has actually kind of fostered a concept where both of the developers and the CSM are kind of not only perceived as sometimes colluding, sometimes combative, sometimes blocking new content that could come in, sometimes they're just rubber stamping. But the thought process is I need to listen to the player base. I need to represent everybody, both those that voted for me and not. Balance that, yes, CCP may have a setup of what they want to do. Whether they decide to reveal the full extent of what they want to do to us before they reveal it to somebody else is another question as well. The NDA will block certain information, but it also means that the NDA is going to have certain things like where, from my understanding of NDAs, is that when certain things become public knowledge, then we are allowed to talk about it. That's usually, and we have a lot of leaking in this game, which is kind of head scratching to say the most. But when the problem is also is here is that, like when we had this Equinox expansion, people were starting to hype this, like hype, 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 hype. And I actually remember posting on Reddit. I was like, look, I'm not particular. I'm not going to do the hype. I want to see what they're going to do because they'll do one thing and they'll change it. And that's why when the Equinox came out, they were literally day one patches. And by now, there's a lot of angst now because almost everything they offered has been practically reversed. And so it's like, to me, it's like, let's just calmly put it down. Let's make sure that we can communicate with both the fan base and CCP. We're the go-betweens, but there's only a certain amount of information we can go out. If people are asking questions for ideas, we need to be firm with okay, the community wants to have certain things buffed. Can we do that? But at the same time, not be combative, but give the option, give ideas out, listen to it. And if CCP if CCP allows the communication to go back the other way, we explain certain things to a certain extent, but within the limitations of what they're going to put on us. And that's actually one of the things I would like to have is actually, hopefully I can set up this, but a Discord where basically there's a filtration process of like ideas and concepts that can be set out. And if there's something that seems worthy or maybe a consideration, that can be then forward through and then say to CCP, this is what's going on. And can we look at this a little bit? And that's actually one of the things I think that's very important to do is to basically leave yourself open to things, give enough wiggle room for CCP to do something, but at least be the voice for the player base so they understand what's going on. I don't think combativeness is going to be beneficial, but we can be constructive in our criticism.
Okay.
That's actually more important, constructive criticism. Because at least constructive criticism, you'd say, okay, this is why this is going on. This, and this. Can we do it this way? And I think that may work better. But that will have to be seen because we have a new expansion coming up. And the biggest problem right this moment is that the EVE community right now is kind of divided between two projects. And these two projects both are kind of pulling in different directions. And there is some antagonism building since of what happened with Equinox, etc. So I'm actually watching it very carefully. But also the same thing is that many choices that are decided on in the next installment of the expansion have probably been discussed with the CSM, of the past. And so when it turns over, sometimes the CSM that's coming in gets a lot of flack for the decisions in the past group. But that will be something we'll work on and within the NDA, communicating ideas or at least ameliorating what the customer is. And like listening to new bros, new players, well, can we get a little bit of this so we can understand how this works a little better? That's how it should do. We listen, we consult. Within the limitations, we can communicate back if allowed, and then we can talk back and forth. At least try to set up more reliable communication lines between the two groups.
Okay, very good. So earlier you were talking about how you only have one account. What is your stance on
Hmm.
multi-boxing?
Well, one thing is very frustrating as well is that multi-boxing has become more and more common. And the reason why is because the costs to mine, to build industry, and even to do PvE or to get what we call escalations in the older system. It's much more profitable to have multiple accounts, but one of the problems is multi-boxing to me papers over some of the problems of EVE Online. Basically, do you know the actual number of actual players in the game?
Who, me?
You know,
Oh,
we
or
have, yes. Mhm. Well, I'll let you answer that one. So, what do you think is the approximate number of actual players in this game? Actual.
I'm gonna guess it's probably gonna be around 20,000.
Okay. From my experience dealing with multi-boxers and the concern I'm hearing in various different areas is that I'm hearing that some like three alts is the minimum, but I am actually seeing players as high as 20, sometimes 30. So that puts a huge variance of how many actual players are in EVE Online because the way in which these accounts are set up, like I use Steam. So Steam counts each player that's actually playing EVE Online very differently from EVE Online's actual numbers. So I'm used to seeing about 2,000 to 3,000 Steam players in the paperwork. So I think it's about between 8,000 to about 5,000. Multi-boxing dilutes the power of the game, dilutes content. Um, it's very, very quick step from multi-boxing to botting. It's a gradual process, but also it can be very direct, and it also makes it very hard then also to identify actual bots because you may have an actual legitimate multi-boxer that is using a lot of tools and equipment to get the most efficient ISK build out. Is his multi-boxing is probably very, very close to a bot, and that can actually also get them banned, which also has certain effects. But it also shows, multi-boxing also shows another problem is that we have issues with standing mechanics. We have issues with how different content actually interacts in the game. It's like, do you do faction warfare or some sort of materials also like in a different part of Empire Space, correct?
Yes,
Okay. So if you get your standings down to a certain point, you can't do anything in those empires, correct?
it's harder.
Yes. Or the faction police are always going to try to kill you as soon as you
Correct.
warp through an area.
Correct.
Mhm. So there are some systems in the game, but they're very, very old, like data centers, that would allow you to buff your standings. But the problem is they're based on the old Cosmos system. So you have no real way other than the SOE arc, the Bloodstained Stars, to rebuild your standings with a faction of choice. Um, and that's a little frustration. Is like we can repair our sec status, our high security status, via actions out in space. By basically killing clone soldiers, taking the tags, turning them into Concord, and repairing our security status. But standings are something you have to be very careful. So a lot of people now they go outside of the standing system by using an alt, and that also feeds into the multi-boxing system. But like you said, incursions, your incursion system, in order to run them efficiently, you have to have massive firepower. Actually, the same thing is kind of in a concept, but also null block fighting. The N+1 ball, because the more people you have in the fleet, the more firepower and damage you can do, and you can knock out a big target. So inherent to Eve is that yes, in an ideal world, it would be each player has their own account. They're playing their own way. You can skill all the weapon systems and everything else, but then you could probably do all your standings and all the other stuff, and you could balance everything out. However, though, that's not exactly what's really in the game at the moment. So a lot of the ways in order to get around those limitations is you actually have to build alts. And so it is very strange for a player like myself who is a solo account to actually show up and play this game solo. It's actually kind of a dying thing in Eve because everybody, think, oh, well, at least the main one character, you have three alts. That's the typical standard now. But it also means that Eve has a problem where you remember when they had the Jita riot over the mining changes?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. CCP, the problem is it also allows big groups to weaponize their subscriptions. So what happens is the null block system can, if they want to add pressure, oh, we're going to protest, we're going to knock off a ton of our subscriptions. And not only does that affect the game from a financial perspective, but it also drops the industry because when you actually turn off a lot of those omegas, the industrial system in the game practically collapses because so many different things in the game require omega, like reactions for T2. You have several like moon mining, and also like more advanced mining ships require omega class. And so what happens is everything collapses in, boom, and it's only on the venture of all things. I mean, you can get around it with, battleships and other stuff fitted really bad, but then the efficiency drops off tremendously. But multi-boxing, to me, multi-boxing gives too many problems and also has a couple dead man hands involved as well. So people can buy their way into content or using their multi-boxing alts can then end up with tons of ISK that allows them to buy into any content, material, ships, and things they want by scale. Multi-boxing and botting are very, very kind of closely related in a way as well. So you have a lot of problems with identification, but also the effects upon the economy by that. Drone assist. The drone assist concept, yes, they're one of the reasons why the drone assist thing has become such a big issue is that people will end up with a multi-alt group with drone assist on a drone bunny, and basically as soon as that drone bunny attacks, boom, the attacked target is usually going to get wiped off the map. But if we had other things that could modify that's this. So to me, I'm not a very big fan of multi-boxing, but because the system's in the game right now, multi-boxing is really only like is kind of the workaround to some of the other systems that are already in the game.
Okay.
So I'm not a big fan of it. I think it should be your own story, your solo account, your solo character. But right now, the logistical and economic thought process of the game, including for own CCP's own financial, multi-boxing is integral to the game.
Okay, so one last question before we get to user questions or
Mm-hmm.
stream questions. Out of everything that we talked about today, when you think about it, what do you think is the most pressing issue that EVE Online has today?
I think one of the biggest problem is mobility and logistics. Um, Movement of materials across this game is a major problem because the reason why places like Jita are so dominant in the game market-wise is because everybody just moves their stuff and takes care of it there. But there's no real movement of goods around Eve, which then would probably mean that different sub-markets, etc., would open up. And it's actually one of the reasons why one of my major things over and over again from last year and this year has always been haulers, because haulers are the backbone of EVE Online, besides mining community. And mining right now it's not in a good spot, but at least we have workarounds to kind of figure out how to work it. The hauling community is basically stuck with very old, locked in, cargo sizes. And so a lot of goods and services can't move where they need to go. And even that includes people moving stuff for strat ops in uh, basically nullsec because most of the time they're going to use a Titan as their dang cargo container, whereas, or some capital, and they can't move, components with smaller ships. And even new players have a hard time moving stuff around the game. So that also means that there's a lot of limitations for people doing certain things in the game because they can't move stuff around. And I think if there was a little bit more mobility of goods, services, and materials, I think players would actually enjoy it more because, like, oh, you started down here. Well, I want to move all the way over to Galente space or over to Caldari space to do something. well, I can pack a couple things in this ship and I can move over there and I can do some content, and then maybe I want to turn around and go somewhere else. There would be a little bit more mobility, but that also means markets can actually follow where the players are instead of being stuck and the players having to constantly move straight to them. And it is a pressing issue because that is one thing. But then the other issue is also the community's thought processes on toxicity. And that is a major issue that is hampering Eve, is because the Whisper campaign on Eve, because that's the thing about Eve. It's not the ads. Because here's one thing: when a company has to use ads in marketing, it immediately starts raising some questions. But if a game is good, and as good as it will sell itself, and people will whisper campaign it. What I'm hearing on the street is the opposite. A lot of people, even though they like the idea and concept of Eve, they don't want to join the game because of a lot of the weird stuff that's been going on over the years, and that has actually been a big problem.
Okay. So,
So it's PR, basically hauling and PR.
okay. Fair enough. And then we do have a question from the Twitch chat. What do you think of your reputation in Eve, and how do you think you can combat that to help your campaign?
You know, sometimes the thing is that a character thought process. I know that the reputation I have, because I'm a kind of an oddball player. I actually like playing this game because I followed the thought process of a pure sandbox. Hull bonuses are just suggestions. You can get a very good, well done ship that's only using those things. But then the ship itself you can fit any which way you want. And once you skilled up to a certain point, you can do anything you'd like. However, he says, I know that some people say, and you'll hear a lot of people, and one of the problems also with the EVE Online particularly, there are a lot of players who've been playing basically what I call informational terrorism on me. And they're always saying I grief, players, etc. I've actually been bringing people who are new bros out to a particular site in my home system because it actually showcases what could have been of EVE Online. And there's a place called Eric Jalian. It's actually a great place for actually teaching a player also knowing that fleet formation combat, the icons for targets and to move to locations. Because you bring the player onto the site, they actually have to interact with items to pick up things. And so by doing so, you actually teach them how to move, but also how to interact with different items in a system. And so that then when they go from that site, now they know how to deal with it elsewhere. And I know my reputation as it is, but also the reputation is different depending on who you ask and who you talk to. There's a lot of people who really like me for things. There are a lot of people who hate me for things. But that's usually typical what happens in EVE. And particularly, I know some people don't like that, but I'm okay with being the mad scientist. I'm willing to, anytime CCP adds a new set of ships and modules, I'm willing to test it out and see what silly stuff I can do. But when it comes to actual EVE things in game, I'm more interested in much more focused down. Let's do the broad spectrum approach. Let's do this. Let's be much more calm and level-headed in dealing with that fit, or let's deal with that new ship or content. Because if we start doing this knee-jerk back and forth, it's not beneficial for the game, and
Okay.
it's not good at all.
So we do have another question that just came in, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but the user came in a little bit late. What is your opinion about high-sec harassment groups and cartels? If you agree that they're a problem for EVE, harassing players out of the game, then what do you feel are appropriate ways to deal with them?
Actually, Masticazam, that's actually a great, interesting question. It's actually something I've been suggesting for some time in a very different thought process. What is the current security status limit for people in HiSec?
What do you mean for?
Oh, okay, so a pirate can get to -10, correct?
Yeah.
So the current limit for people on the positive side is 5. So what if you put it to +10? And I do know there's actually some older players who actually have some of the older standings. I've actually met with some of them out in LowSec. So they actually have more than 5 positive standing. So the thought process is that there are people who are, the harassment cartel, etc. One of the things in thought process is if you allow the players to at least be able to build up the security status and they can fight back, Eve will become, as Drake Idion likes to say this, he wants it to become a bloodier fighting spot. I was like, well, if you actually increase the security status of players, some people actually might be more aggressive because then they will go down into low sec to pick a fight, or they might see a ganker that's been ganking them, contact, they'll go after them. So, because they know that if they do lose, even if they might be concorded in response, they at least had put the fight down. And it actually would be a very healthy thing if there's actually a capability to attack back and actually use the mechanics of the game to actually do that. But if there's somebody who is very notorious, I mean, and we're talking they're really bad, then that's on the ISD and CCP to deal with them. Because like if they're really, really bad and they've been known to do some really, really bad stuff, that's when it falls on CCP or ISD to deal with them. The majority of the mechanics that are now in the game have made it a little easier to deal with some problems, but I still think that we need the security status bumped up to 10, because then what will happen is it'll allow players to actually take active actions. And let's say someone keeps constantly attacking you, now you can attack back instead of taking a strike that immediately punts you out of high sec for a while.
Okay. One last question for you, and then we'll be done with this interview. What other candidates out of the 50 that are running would you like to see elected alongside you?
I actually like Mike. I actually think he would probably be a good foil for me because Mike Azariah has had a lot of experience in Eve, and he actually is well known among both not only the new bros but a lot of players. He's kind of like right now, he was the elder statesman right now of the game at the moment. I was hoping Brisk would run this year because I actually prefer to have him as well because he's also an elder statesman in the game as well. But he's not running that I know of at this moment. Prospector, I actually have an interest because his ideas and concepts kind of align with some ideas, but I'm more interested for the non-alignment side that there should be players who are not part of no blocks to actually join in. And that's one of the thought processes I have.
Okay, so if people would like to talk to you more about your ideas or the things that you said in this interview, how can they contact you?
Currently, right now, it's going to be on the Eve Discord. You can find me there, or you can actually find me in various other channels. And you can probably interact with me on that process. Oh, and we have an ad.
Yeah, I hate Twitch ads. It's over in 1 minute. But this is recording, so people can get this last
Okay, no
bit.
problem.
I will put your forum thread down in the description, and anything else that you would like me to put down there. And
I'm still working on some materials, but that will be done for Reddit, but I'm actually having to upload them right now. So I had to do your interview before I did anything else today. So I'm sorry if I don't have everything totally 100% done at this moment, but I will
not a
there will
problem.
be a Reddit forum. Yeah, so there'll be a Reddit post that will probably pop up in a little bit.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. I really
Mhm.
appreciate it. I hope it gives everyone a little bit more insight on who you are as a candidate, and it will help drive their decision.
Right? And I hope that everybody, and I hope that everything else is, and I will say this also as well. Did you read the section about the CSM pledge?
Yes.
Yes. Um, that's one of the things that I really would rather strike and very put this is that I think that if you vote as the CSM and you're in the CSM, let's do the representative first, and then everything else is like a secondary. But I would like to make sure that says that the interests of the new bros as they come in, if there's any questions or things, or if they even have a suggestion of something, we should list to them, and we'll try to list for it. That's why I'm wanting a broad spectrum. New bros, low sec, high sec, null sec, wormhole space, and poachfin. Everybody, and even Zarzak, everybody should be at least representative. Even if they didn't vote for you, represent them, listen to their concerns. That's how it should be done.
All right. And again, thank you so much, and we will talk to you guys in Twitch chat soon.